Alrighty, World History A students, Tree Hall here, and the purpose of this video is to kind of give you a review of Unit 1, which is Early Civilizations. A lot of material to cover here, and first thing I want to mention is that this is not really meant to replace the study guide. I mean, I think that this will help you do well on the exam, and I'm certainly looking at the exam when I do this, but I just want to point out, I'm going to bring up the study guide here right now, that just before the Unit 1 exam, you've got the study guide. I also put this in teacher notes right at the beginning of the unit. These questions here are directly related to the test. So if it's on the test, it's on here. If it's on here, it's on the test. And generally, as I give you the story of this unit, I'm going to cover all of this, but I'm not going to cover every little absolute aspect of it. So I just think that it's kind of important to know that. This is going to be more of the story, the overview. So anyway, a lot of slides to cover. Let's get going. I hope I get done with this in less than 20 minutes. Let's move to slide 2. Okay, so the story of the origin of humanity, the important thing to know is anatomically correct modern humans, aka not Neanderthals, Cro-Mags, or no, they are Cro-Mags. That's the difference. Anyway, we came from Africa, as you can see in this chart. And you can kind of see what's neat about this one is it shows the route that we took. So you can see that we leave Africa here and we go around and see these 50K, 60K, 40K, 16K, 15K. This shows when we got to places. And so 65,000 years ago, Australia 50,000 years ago, North America 16,000 years ago, Europe 40,000 years ago. Now, by the way, you should ask yourself why Australia and China and India before, say, Europe or America. Well, keep in mind that 65,000 years ago was an ice age, and everything up north on this chart was covered with ice. That is also why when you look at America, you can see that people basically got to the coast of South America before they actually penetrated the interior of America. Again, ice ages. So people go where the weather lets them. Okay, let's move on. So people, as they move out of Africa and they're using stone tools, we call that the Stone Age, and the Stone Age is broken up into two eras, the Paleolithic Age, which is the Old Stone Age, and the Neolithic Age, which is the New Stone Age. Now, let's talk about the Neolithic Age because that is an important time. So basically, for a long time, people run around chasing herds, and this is how human beings make their living. We're hunters and gatherers. So the meat that we eat, we chase as herds. The vegetables that we eat, we just pick up and gather as we go along. And then something really huge happens at the end of the Neolithic era that changes everything, and that is really the discover and practice of formal agriculture. At some point, people began to realize that certain areas that they were wandering into grew more vegetables than others and more crops, and they said, you know, rather than kind of like chasing the herds, we got this different idea. Let's domesticate the animals that we kill and keep them in pens so we don't have to run after them with our spears, and let's actually settle down and plant crops. And what you see here in this particular slide is a picture of four old world river valley cultures. One is Egypt, and you can see the Nile River. By the way, what you'll notice here is a river runs through all of these. You can see Sumeria or Mesopotamia, and you can see the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In India, you have a civilization called the Mohenjo-Daro civilization, and you can see that the Indus and Ganges rivers. And in China, which I covered most of, you can see that the Yangtze and Yellow rivers. What do all these have in common? Well, not only do rivers run through all these places where people stopped roaming, but they were special places in that the rivers flooded every year, and the flood was good sediment, so they realized that they could really make a go of it farming. And the first um, city that we can find ruins of is a place called Çatalhöyük, and that is right at the top of the Fertile Crescent. Çatalhöyük is in today's nation of Turkey, so it's in this area right here, and people settle down and they start farming, and it causes them to change their lifestyle. They stop chasing the herd, and you have the end of the Stone Age because people begin to use bronze and copper instead of stone, and you also have the beginning of civilization. So what I'm going to transition to next this is talking about how farming creates civilization. So basically, civilization is different than society in that, society is any time people live together. And of course, people did that right from the beginning. Cavemen lived together, and people, when they chased the herds, lived in tribes that wandered and chased the herds. So that's society. All societies have culture too, and that is the way that they kind of transmit their ideas to each other and their view of the world and their language and religion and all of this. But civilization is something special. It's a society that has five things: one, cities; two, specialized workers; three, record keeping and writing; four, advanced technology; and five, complex institutions. And what was interesting was the agricultural revolution, which was again the settlement to farming. It kind of created all of these things. In the olden days, when you chased the herd, everybody had the same job. Everybody would be, if you were a guy, you were a hunter. If you were a woman, you were a gatherer. And if you broke your spear as a hunter, you made a new spear. And generally, societies were, the tribes that people wandered in were not very large because the herds they chased were not very large. If your tribe got too large, what would happen is you would literally have to split up, and you say, you go chase a new herd, our herd can't support you. And so what happened when people settled down is one, agriculture was a lot more efficient than chasing the herd. So the first thing that could happen is you could support a lot more people. With a lot more people suddenly being in one place, you had the rise of cities. And what cities would be in the sense of Katul Hayuk is you had this centralized area. Now, all around it was farmland, but in the middle, there was enough people that lived in this farmland that people actually set up a little spot in the middle of it to trade with each other. And you had this specialized working. Now suddenly, there's enough people farming to where one person could specialize in just making pots. If you lived in a little tribe of 300 people, that didn't work. But now suddenly, if there's 50,000 people in your area, you can spend all day long making pots, and all you do is make pots. And then the farmers come in, they trade crops with you, and you give them the pots to store their crops. They give you their crops, and so the first thing that happens is the creation of this centralized hub cities. The second thing that happens is you have specialized workers, and then the natural outgrowth of that is record keeping and writing. And by the way, one of the developments that ends the area of prehistory, which goes all the way up from caveman times to the beginning of the agricultural revolution, one of the developments that comes out of this in the Neolithic Revolution is the invention of writing. This ends prehistory because prehistory is before the written record. And that's the other thing. Trade facilitates writing. If I'm making pots and I'm giving them to farmers, I need a record. If somebody doesn't live up to their end of the bargain, I need to say, hey, you promised me you were going to give me crops back in June. You promised me that in August you'd give me crops for these pots that I made you in June, and now here it's August and I need my crops. So you have, and that's the funny thing. Cuneiform, which was the first form of writing that you see in the Fertile Crescent and in the world, indeed, most of the records we find of cuneiform are receipts. What a surprise. If you looked at today's day and age, we think of all the writing that we have. How much do we have that's actually in receipts? And that also, the other thing too, labor specialization not only leads to writing and record keeping, but it leads to advanced technology. In the olden days, in the Paleolithic era, if a spear breaks, the guy who was chucking that spear, he makes a new spear. Everybody makes spears. Nobody's all that good at making spears because not only do they make spears, but they have to chase after the herd. I mean, everybody has all these different jobs they do. Now suddenly that everybody is in one place and you've got this large population base, one person makes pots, another person sits down and makes spears, and that's all he does. See, again, in the olden day, you would make a spear if your spear broke, but then you'd go back out to chasing the herd and gathering crops and whatever. Now that you live in a city, one person makes pots, another person makes spears, and that's all they do. And lo and behold, because they do this all day long, every day, they start getting better and better at making spears, and so you have this technology explosion. And that's what happens when people settle down at the end of the Neolithic era. They begin to make better spears, better wheels, better everything. So you have this technology explosion. Again, it's linked to specialization, labor specialization. And then the last thing that happens that defines civilization is you have complex institutions. I had mentioned that now suddenly people who make pottery are trading with farmers. Now, who's going to enforce whether the farmer pays or not? Now you need government. Who's going to build the irrigation canals? You need government. And so basically, what ends up happening is people settle down and they start to form these farm cities that create civilization. Everything that we know of civilization today, and that is specialization, advanced technology, complex institutions, record keeping. This all happens just kind of organically as people settle down. Now let's move on to the next slide. So let's talk about Mesopotamia and Sumeria. What I have here is a picture of what they call the Fertile Crescent, and you can see the reason they call it a crescent is because it goes like this. This is a green area in the middle of the desert, and it's also an area where all the rivers flood and crops are grown really well. And this also happens to be the first place where we really see civilization take hold, not the last, but the first. And basically, all the cultures that show up here kind of imitate each other, and they keep growing. And so what I have here is I have a map. Basically everybody sits down, they start to farm. You've got these the first thing that you see is the rise of the city-states. One of the earliest kings that becomes very successful and takes over all these other city-states around him and creates what is it? It's not the Assyrian or the Babylonian, and it's not even the Hittite. It's another empire. Was Hammurabi. And you can see up here, I've got a picture of Hammurabi's code. You guys read some of these, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Basically, they called this the cuneiform world because every empire that would come after the Amorite was what Hammurabi was. He was an Amorite. So that was the first empire, the Amorite Empire. Then you had the Hittites. Then you had the Babylonians. Then you had the Assyrians. And the last empire is going to be the Persians. And each empire gets a little bit bigger, conquers the one before, and copies, for the most part, everything that came before it. So I have some pictures over here of some really significant developments in the Fertile Crescent that would influence the rest of the world forevermore. Obviously, the first form of writing was cuneiform, and that was something I had mentioned. Really complicated form of writing, something like 3,000 letters. So sometime during this whole Sumerian era, a group of people called the Phoenicians, who actually didn't farm. What they ended up doing is developing boats, and they traded. And they developed a much better alphabet. And I've got a picture of this over here. This was the Phoenician alphabet. There was only 24 letters. You can see their capital city is Byblos. Now, a couple things that I think are important. Byblos, that should kind of remind you of a Bible, or a library. That comes from that. Also, the word Phoenician, we still use their name in our alphabet system today because we stole their alphabet. The Greeks would steal this alphabet, and then the Romans would steal that, and, well, make a long story short, we're still using it. And what made the Phoenician alphabet different than cuneiform was that instead of having a picture for every word, they used sounds. And nowadays, we never think about this, but our alphabet is phonetic. It is organized around sounds, and that word phoneme is just that's the Greek for Phoenician. So that's where we get that. Another invention from the Sumerian world over here is the calendar. Even back in the days, way back in the days, they invented calendars. And, something else that's important. We'll get to that when we get to Moses over here. They invented calendars. Calendars have become very important in a day and age when crops are important. If you think about farmers, they have to know when to plant. And so here's a Babylonian calendar. One other invention that kind of comes out of this era that kind of goes against everything else that from this era is the invention of monotheism. And here's a picture of Moses. And of course, he's descended from Abraham. So one of the things that is also copied from every Sumerian culture from one to another is their polytheistic system. They worship many gods. Their gods were kind of angry gods, not very nice. And not surprisingly, the most important gods were the god of the sun and the god of the rain, because they're planting crops and all of this. And yet, one little group of people, the Israelites, who came originally, Abraham was from Uruk. He cruises over to Canaan over here on the west side of the Fertile Crescent, and he believes that God had called him to move out of the Sumerian world, kind of, or on the far end of it, and to create a culture that just worships one God. And that's monotheism, which later will become very, very huge in world history. So you got Moses over there who looks like Chuck Heston with the Ten Commandments. Anyway, this is Sumeria, the Fertile Crescent, and this also covers what they call the Bronze Age, the first 1,000 years of 2,000 years of human civilization from about 6,000 to 4,000 BC, or actually we should probably say 3,000 years, maybe 5,000 to 2,000 BC. One of an important development around 1500 BC that comes with the Assyrians is the ability to make tools of iron, which is much stronger than bronze. And the Assyrians are going to use their iron weapons to take over that world, and they will rule for a while. Then you're going to have a second Babylonian empire, and up to about 500 BC, you eventually, that entire area gets taken over by a group of people called the Persians. And you see a map here. This again is the Fertile Crescent, and this is a map of the Persian Empire. So basically, from the beginning of human civilization up to about 500 BC, where it's at is the Fertile Crescent. And 500 BC, you have the biggest of all the Fertile Crescent empires, ruled by a guy named Cyrus the Great, who's over in the right-hand corner. Another invention, by the way, that the Persians added to all the inventions that the Fertile Crescent is already famous for was coins, currency. So that's that. We're going to come back to this area when Alexander the Great takes it over. Let's take a little detour right now to ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt is super cool. They're doing all the same things that you see in the Fertile Crescent, but they built pyramids too. And weirdly enough, though, they don't influence world history all that much because it's a little bit isolated. Lots of deserts. On the Unit 1 test, here's a little hint. You're only asked one question about ancient Egypt, and it's not even about ancient Egypt. It's about the Nubians who were south of them and who also built pyramids and shared a lot with the ancient Egyptian culture. So now you know, if you're asked to identify that group, it's the Nubians. Anyway, just thought I'd throw that at you. Now let's move on to ancient Greece. So again, 1500 BC, the Iron Age comes in. And the other thing that had happened, so again, you start really seeing the rise of cities about 5000 BC. So about 3,500 years goes along during the Bronze Age, and in the center of the world is Sumeria. There's also civilizations over in India and China, but they're not important to the central story of world history, at least as far as the development of everything that we know in the West, because they're off doing their thing and it's a long ways away. But anyway, by about 1500 BC, you now come into the Iron Age, and you begin to see, civilization's been around for a few thousand years. You begin to see some real big changes in civilization in 1500 BC. Over in the West, the center of importance begins to shift over westward towards Greece. And Greece in the Iron Age was really an interesting area because Greece is a very mountainous area. They don't unite like the Fertile Crescent did. You could have two cities that are almost next to each other in Greece, and the only way you can get to those two cities is by water. So what happens politically in Greece is you have the Greeks develop into a series of city-states, and they had branched out in the Bronze Age, and then their city-states were destroyed in the Bronze Age, and then they begin to rebuild again in the Iron Age. And of course, the story of the destruction of the city-states in the Bronze Age is told by Homer, who lives in Iron Age Greece, and he was actually, they think he was a shepherd, and he would go around. He saw all these ruined cities, and he thought, what ruined such a great civilization? And of course, the story he invented to explain the destruction of Bronze Age Greece was the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey, where there was this great raid, and then the gods punished civilization. Anyway, going back to Iron Age Greece, big developments in the Iron Age. what happens is the Greek city-states begin to do all these political experiments, and they create new forms of art, culture, and most important, new political forms. And so let me explain this picture. In the center of this picture, you see the city-state of Athens, important in world history because this is the birthplace of democracy, which is what most governments are now. What you see in the corners here, we have the Greek gods. You've got a statue that represents the Greek gods here. The Greeks had a really cool value system that a lot of people decided to imitate later in the world, and that was the Greeks didn't care who you were born to. It was all about the individual talent, and they believed that gods kind of watched us, and if we had a lot going for us, gods could make things happen in our life. And the Greeks called this idea arete. And the best way to explain how that kind of worked out in world history is today you've got the Nike slogan, just do it. Like, hey, if you go out there and just try to make it happen, and you really care enough, and you put it all on the line, great things can happen for you. And that was one of the things that caused the Greek culture to be very attractive to people around it. If you grew up in Sumeria, it was all about who you were born to. If you were born a nobleman, you died a nobleman. If you were born a farmer, you died a farmer. And then the Greeks, they had these gods that didn't value that. Their gods said, man, if that person's got a big heart and courage and really wants to do it, I want him to be born a farmer and die a king. And we even get this idea of tyrant from the Greeks, and that didn't mean something bad in their era. That meant a tyrant meant king by his own hand. That was something huge. So you get the Greek god system, and that kind of fueled everything they did. The Greeks really believed that every person was just amazing, and if you just stuck with things, you could make an impact. And that was one of the reasons why their culture created so much that we still use today. And when you look at their ancient ruins, they're fantastic. Over on the right is a picture of Plato and no, Socrates and Aristotle, both Greek philosophers. The Greeks had created huge advances in science and reason and philosophy. In the far right hand corner on the bottom, you see an amphitheater. The Greeks also had all of these plays. They had this weird notion that it was actually a civic duty to watch plays because the plays kind of taught morality and taught us, like what is right and wrong. And over in the far left, you have a picture of Pericles. He is the father of Athenian democracy. So you had all these Greek city states, and they were doing all this stuff politically. And one of the things that they created that really takes hold is this idea of democracy, that the people should rule themselves. And so Greece is the first area in the world where you start to see people vote on things, and this notion of citizenship, that's going to become a really big deal later on. Okay, now let's talk about classical Greece, because that's what I was just mentioning. As the Greeks developed these new political ideas, and their culture really began to flourish, they built boats, they traded, they actually become a power in the world around 600 BC. So 1500 is the Iron Age. By 600, the Greeks are really just kind of pushing over everywhere. They're leaving Greece. They're establishing colonies over in Italy and over in Turkey, which is the far edge of the Sumerian world. That's going to become important in the next slide. And they're trading with everybody, and Greek ideas are getting pushed around. And eventually the Greeks have this idea that if we could ever unite, we could really take over the world because we're the toughest people around. And they were. They were great fighters. They had great military technology. That never really happened under the Greeks. But then what did happen, the Greeks end up fighting this huge battle with Persia around 500 BC, and they win. That was the amazing thing. So the idea was they were supposed to unite and then go take over Persia, but instead they got into a war and they fought each other. That was one of the problems with the Greeks. They were hugely ambitious, hugely competitive, and their favorite hobby was killing each other. So they never did unite. And eventually what would happen is the Macedonians, who lived a little north of Greece, did unite, and they take over the Greeks. And one of the Macedonian kings, Philip, dies, and his son Alexander takes over. Alexander unites all the Greeks and finally fulfills this Greek idea of taking over the Sumerian world, which, again, back then, to those people, that's the center of the world. Keep in mind that China and India, they're a long way away. They don't really know what's going on over there. But anyway, Alexander takes over the Persian Empire. So let me go back to this slide for a sec. Gets into a tussle with the Persians, takes over the Persian Empire, and the most important part of that is what he does is he spreads the Greek ideas all around the ancient world. And he's also very good at founding cities. Everywhere he goes, he creates new cities and he names them after himself. The most famous Alexandria, there was actually many, many different Alexandrias here, but the most famous Alexandria was one in Egypt that housed a library where the Greeks collected all the knowledge of the ancient world. Now, you see this picture down here? That's the Romans burning that library down when they conquered Greece. There was a big civil war in Rome. Antony and Cleopatra were fighting on the Greek side, which, Egypt at that time was ruled by the Greeks, and they lost, and the Romans built or burned Alexandria down, and one of the casualties of that was they burned down this library, which was one of the wonders of the ancient world. So anyway, that was the Greek world, and Greeks kind of dominate the world for about 500 years, and then the Romans take over. Now, again, going back to Greek ideas of government and really Greeks on the rise, 500 BC, 600 BC, they began to really heavy colonize Rome. Or Italy, which you can see here. Now, Italy already had people in it, but they're influenced very heavily by Greek ideas. And eventually, what ends up happening is the Romans begin to kind of run with this as the Greeks fight each other. Alexander goes to the east. The Romans gradually take over all this area that the Greeks had under Italy, and then they begin to take over the rest of the world. Now, what is interesting about the Romans, they really believed that the Greeks had the right idea in culture. And what's funny, when you look at the Roman culture, it's like an imitation of the Greek culture. The Greeks have Zeus, he's the head god. The Romans call Zeus Jupiter. The Greeks have Ares, the god of war. The Romans call Ares Mars. So they copy the Greek religious system and its culture. But the Romans always said, the Greeks, they were kind of smart politically, but we're really smart politically. And what they did is they copied as much as they could of the Greek government. And what you see a picture of here in this slide is the Roman Senate. And in 509 BC, the Romans overthrow the last tyrant, a king by their own hand that they had, and they create this new form of government that the world has never seen before, and it's called a republic. Now, you've asked yourself, what is a republic, and how's that different if there's a Senate here and people are voting? How would that be different from democracy? So the Romans had studied Greek history, and one of the things that they discovered is they said democracy is cool, but it can be unstable. People think one thing one day and then another thing the next, and they found democracy to be too unstable a form of government. But then they also felt that every other form of government eventually became unstable as well. They said, okay, in democracy, the problem is eventually the people start demanding too much and they overthrow their leaders, and that's bad. But they said the other problem, though, if you just have a king, eventually he becomes too crazy and he starts like overtaxing people, and there's nobody to really balance him out. He becomes terrible too. So maybe you just give power to just a few people, the aristocrats, and you have aristocracy, and they rule. Oh, but the problem is eventually they do things that benefit their class, and they really hurt the poor and everybody else. So the Romans said the problem with every form of government is it eventually becomes bad. So the best form of government is the form of government that has separation of power and there's a balance of power. Maybe you do have a king, but the king shares power with the aristocrats and with the people. And that is what a republic is. You have a constitution that separates powers into executive, legislative, and judicial branches, and then you give everybody a little bit of power. And the idea is these different branches kind of balance each other out. Now, if this all sounds weirdly familiar to you, it's because this is the type of government that most governments are using today. We stole this from the Romans. One could even argue that the Roman form of world never really totally collapsed because we took their government and we're all using it today. And again, that's the great Roman contribution to the world. It's not the only Roman contribution. By the way, in this picture, something kind of interesting, he's a little hidden, but down here in the far right-hand corner, so the person that is orating right now is a famous Roman senator called Cicero. And in the corner, just kind of sitting by himself, is a young Roman senator. Maybe he's just not really liking um, um, democracy so much. Maybe it's not working for him. His name is Julius Caesar. He will eventually get enough power to where he'll be able to overthrow the Senate, and he creates a government that is just underneath him. Of course, then he's killed, but then his nephew Augustus comes in and takes over. Rome is not always a republic with democracy. For about 500 years, well, no, I should say about 250 years, Rome operates with a democratic republic, and then in the life of Julius Caesar, that republic is overthrown and Rome becomes an empire where you have hereditary leadership. You've got one person that takes control. They still had a Senate, but the Senate no longer mattered. And that form of Rome is going to last until about 500 AD. And I want to show you a new map here. It expands. Over here, you still see Sumeria and the Fertile Crescent. Rome rules that. But then Rome also expands all the way up into Europe. And by 500 AD, the Roman civil. I'm going to move you over there. I'm going to move you over there. Sorry, I thought I'd move these. The Roman civilization, they had taken that Sumerian civilization, they had improved it, and they had expanded it mostly through Europe as well. Some Roman innovations. So you can see over in the lower left-hand corner, Romans had really awesome roads. And that's how they held their empire together. They built these awesome roads. These roads you can find throughout Europe to this day. People are still using them. They were built, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, and they still work because they were all stone. And the Romans were great, great, great builders. They also took the Greek alphabet and they kind of changed it a little bit, and they made it into the language they spoke was Latin. When you look over here, you can see the Latin alphabet. If it looks somewhat familiar to you, it's because the Latin alphabet is our alphabet. It's just all the capital letters. So we would use later a medieval ruler named Charlemagne would invent lowercase letters, but essentially that Latin alphabet, and we'll recognize a lot of Latin words. That is something that the Romans use, and we still use a lot today in English. The other thing too, you can see over here Roman aqueducts. Couple things: Romans invented cement, and they were really obsessed with water. Everywhere they went, they would when they took over an area, they would start creating fountains everywhere. And they would build aqueducts into the city, and so a lot of people, as Rome took places over, a lot of people didn't really necessarily like being ruled by the Romans, but they had to admit that in a lot of ways they were better off. And the Romans were really pragmatic about how they did civilization. When they took over your area, they would say, okay, right now you're not citizens, you're just conquered. But if you don't rebel and if you stay under us for long enough, then eventually we will grant you a path towards citizenship. And the Roman citizens had a lot of the rights that we as Americans enjoy as citizens too. You couldn't be accused of if you were accused of a crime, you had a right to a fair trial. They couldn't just jail you without a trial. They couldn't kill you without a trial. So they had all these rights, and that made Rome something that was worthwhile. And Rome becomes kind of the huge power of the ancient world. So some of the things that Rome brought, and some of the things that make them great. Now let's move over to India. So I had concentrated on the West and the Sumerian, the Fertile Crescent, but India was also a place that got settled early on, and India becomes home to huge civilizations. And among other things, four of the major world religions come out of India. You can see pictures, and that's a test question, by the way. You can see pictures on the lower left-hand corner is just kind of a picture that represents Hinduism. So the thing about India is early on they create this religious system where it's polytheistic, just like the Sumerians. But one thing that is different than the Sumerian culture in the Indian world system is that they believe in reincarnation. That people go through several life cycles. So you are born into a life, you live this life. When you die, you come back in another life. And part of the Hindu religion in India, you had a very rigid cultural system with classes. You had the upper class, the middle class, the lower class, and they called these castes. Now, that word caste, what you probably think of when you hear that is somebody's, something that they're wearing on their broken arm. And that is because the reason that the British called this the caste system, and they did use that, meaning a cast like you put on a broken arm, because it was absolutely rigid. You couldn't change. If you were born into, say, the Brahmin caste, like Buddha was, Siddhartha Gautama is the name of Buddha. If you were born into that caste, no matter what you did, you stayed in that caste. If your father was a priest, you became a priest. If you were born into the untouchable caste and your job was cleaning sewage, no matter who you were, what talents you had, no matter what you were, you stayed in that caste as well. And the when later cultures came in, that when the Greeks saw this, they didn't like it too much. When the British saw this, they didn't like it too much. But this was the Indian system, and to some degree, this still is the system that you find in India today. It is very important what caste that you're born in. Now, one person who didn't like the caste system at all, who was born at the top of that, was a guy named Siddhartha Gautama. He was around about 500 BC, and the Hindus believed that if you lived enough lives, you might be able to attain enlightenment. And enlightenment is this place where you reach wisdom and you find that you can love all people, and you no longer have any of the really bad things in you, like ambition or selfishness or meanness. And anyway, Gautama attained that in one lifetime. And you see a picture over on the right of Buddha sitting underneath a tree. He kind of lived somewhere kind of lived in this region right here, in between India and Nepal now. And anyway, he started a new religion called Buddhism, and eventually that too comes out of India. The picture that I've got right here is of one of the great civilizations of India called the Mauryan civilization. You can see 250 BC. They had conquered most of India. One of the things that the Mauryans export out of India, and you can see over here these guys with their orange outfits, they actually sent Buddhist missionaries into all over East Asia, and Buddhism becomes one of the huge world religions. Starts in India, but gets practiced throughout East Asia, including China, and that was because of the Mauryan missionaries. Now let's move into China itself. By the way, another of the early river civilizations that becomes one of the great civilizations of the world, at least equal to the power of Rome, but again, not as, it's isolated. So from our point of view, from the Western point of view, we don't hear as much about it because it's so far over. But from their point of view, they're not worried about the West because this is such a huge area. Anyway, this I'm showing a picture of Han China. China becomes China under a guy named Shui Huangti, and he creates the Qin dynasty. This is where we get China, starts the Great Wall. You can see over here a picture of these terracotta warriors. You read about him. He created, before he died, basically makes this city underground where he spent years doing this. Takes lifelike reproductions of his soldiers, and he creates this huge army that gets buried with him in his tomb. One of the great wonders of the ancient world. And actually, it's weird. I saw a documentary on this one time. They were saying that what he, by today's standards, we go, wow, it's really weird. Why would somebody do that? Actually, what he had done is he had broken with tradition. A lot of the rulers that came before him would actually kill like hundreds of their soldiers and get buried with them. He liked his soldiers too much. He said, I don't want to kill these guys. I'm going to make reproductions of them to get buried with me. And so that was kind of a nice thing that he did. Anyway, some major inventions from China that would influence the rest of the world: the compass, gunpowder, porcelain, which you see over here, which for years we called China. It was the best form of clay pot that can be made. We're still making porcelain. Paper, the Chinese printing press, many other things. But that was a contribution that influenced all of world civilizations. So what I've basically done here is I've kind of given you a real bird's eye view of the civilizations you covered in Unit 1. As we enter into Unit 2, we'll just kind of pick up the story where we left off. We've also covered probably the first 100,000 years of human civilization, and where we leave off here is about 500 AD, and we're going to pick up the story in Unit 2 at 500 AD, but we've gone from, about 6,000 BC is when you have the Neolithic Revolution. Then you have all of these different cultures that develop, all, again, what's interesting, in fertile river valleys that kind of give rise to what we would term civilization. And by the time we leave off, all of these civilizations are mature and are kind of laying down the framework for the types of religion we're going to see later on, the types of government we see later on, some of the really important items of technology that we're going to see later on, the economics and trade. So anyway, I hope that this gives you a little bit of a overall view of what happens in Unit 1, and maybe might help you on the test and also kind of help you understand the story, because that's the important thing in history. Thanks for listening, guys. Bye-bye.